Hello again, everyone. It's me, MadameMacabre. You might also know me as Katie O'Loughlin. It's been a while, hasn't it? I do have some fun news, though. This past year, I've been working hard on putting together a book of scary stories. It's called Don't Open the Door: Scary Stories and American Folktales. It's an anthology of 24 short scary stories and retellings of popular urban legends, all with my own original twist, of course. I've aimed to make this a book that can be enjoyed by the whole family. It's free of foul language, ideologically sensitive subjects, and excessive gore. After all, a good scare doesn't need to be filled with blood and guts to haunt the back of your mind for days. I'm more about that psychological horror anyway. That being said, it's probably best that readers be at least 10 years old, as it was written at more of a tween-teen reading level. Anyways, I am thrilled to say that I have managed to get this book out just in time for spooky season. You'll be able to grab it in both ebook and paperback on Amazon and Kindle. I've gone ahead and included links in the description below, so if you feel so moved, go ahead and check it out. And to help whet your appetite for spooky season, I've decided that today I'll be sharing 3 stories from my book with you. So gather close and dim the lights, because it's time for some good old-fashioned ghost stories. Story number 1, 3 Knocks. Growing up, my grandma always had a lot of funny superstitions. One in particular always haunted my mind the most. She said that if you hear 3 knocks on your door at night, never, ever answer it. You go right back to doing what you did before and you pretend you didn't hear anything at all. Now, hearing this made me very curious. I asked if she could explain why I should ignore the knocking. She got a serious look on her face and sighed. She then told me a story. There once was a woman who lived all alone. On a dark and stormy night, she sat in front of a roaring fire and worked on knitting a scarf. It had been a pleasant day and she had no reason to be afraid of anything. That's why when she heard the knocking, she didn't think anything out of place. She had been sitting in her rocking chair, happily humming, when the loud sound of 3 knocks rang out. This surprised the woman, as she had not been expecting company. She got out of her chair and slowly walked toward the front door. She leaned in to look through the peephole, but there was no one there. Deciding it must have been the wind knocking some branches into the house, she went back to her seat. Another hour passed, and suddenly the sound rang out again. Knock, knock, knock. Again she got up, and again she went to the door. She looked through the peephole again, but still saw no one. She tried telling herself it was the wind again, but she was beginning to grow doubtful. Having heard the sound twice, it really didn't sound like branches. It was knocking. Another hour passed, and just as the woman was getting ready for bed, the front door knocked 3 more times, this time much louder than before. Knock, knock, knock. With a shaky hand, the woman grabbed the old baseball bat she kept tucked by her bed and walked down the hall toward the front door. Slowly, she looked through the peephole, and just like the other 2 times, there was no sign of anyone. Having had enough, she shouted through the door, "Who's there? What do you want?" There was silence for a moment, but then a deep and terribly raspy voice answered her. "Let me in." The woman clutched her bat and shouted again, "I don't know who you are, but you need to leave. I'm armed." But the voice did not speak again, and once more, things grew quiet. The woman was quite afraid now, so she slept with the bat in her bed. For a while, it seemed like the troubles were over with. But then, another hour passed, and the sound came again. Slightly different this time. Knock, knock, knock. 3 knocks rang out, but this time, from the glass of her window, the deep, raspy voice called out, "Let me in." The woman leapt out of bed and shouted back, "Get out of here! I will call the police! I'm warning you, I'm armed!" The room fell silent once more, and eventually the woman walked up to her window and looked through the blinds. There was no one there. The woman was far too frightened to go back to sleep now, so she returned downstairs to sit next to her telephone. She was determined to get to the bottom of this. Another hour passed, and the clock struck midnight. Knock, knock, knock. It was back at the front door again. Finally, the woman had enough. She picked up her baseball bat and charged to the front door. She flung the door wide open and aimed ahead. But once again, there was no one there. She looked high and low, but there was no sign of anyone. There weren't even muddy footprints. It was as if she were totally alone. She stood there for a few minutes, but nothing more happened. Eventually, she grew tired and went back inside. The rest of the night passed and there was no more knocking. The woman decided to write the whole thing off as something her tired mind must have created. She felt silly for having gotten so worked up. But the very next day, while in town, the woman was hit by a car and died. If you hear 3 knocks at night, never, ever answer. Ignore them and pretend you heard nothing at all. By the time the sun rises, they'll be gone to some other place. You never, ever answer the knocking, because if you do, they foretell the death of someone. Or at least, that's just what Grandma says. Story number 2, The Lighthouse. I once heard a story from a town not far from here. It sat on the coast and was a lovely place to live. It did, however, have a dark secret. Out on the edge of town, beyond the boardwalk and past the slippery rocks, sat an old lighthouse. These days it's automatically run, but many years ago it was operated by a lighthouse keeper. That's where this story takes a dark turn. For many years, the lighthouse keeper lived completely alone. He used to come into town here and there, but over time, he stopped even that. The only reason the people of the town knew he was still around was the fact that the lighthouse still operated normally. But one night, the people of the town noticed that the lighthouse didn't light up. A group of people went to investigate and were met by a grisly sight. The old lighthouse keeper must have finally been driven mad by the isolation. He had thrown himself from the top of the tower and smashed down to the rocks below. It was after this event that the town decided to invest in an automatic system so no one would need to go out to the lighthouse anymore. And so they did. But that didn't stop people from going out. In time, the lighthouse became the subject of a local legend. All the school kids claimed that the ghost of the lighthouse keeper remained in the tower, and if you were brave enough, you could go see him. As a result, the kids would often try to sneak out to the old lighthouse. Almost all of the time they got too scared and turned around less than halfway through, and so the legend grew. One day, a particularly brave boy declared to his classmates that he would make it all the way to the top of the tower and would see the phantom for himself. By doing this, he'd earn the title of the bravest boy in town. Many of the school kids cheered him on and a few begged him not to go, but the boy was determined. And so, one particularly foggy night, the boy set out to the lighthouse. When he got to the building, he looked it over. The old house was nailed up with old boards partially rotten by the sea breeze. It wouldn't take much to get inside. In fact, the planks covering the door had already been pried loose by other children previously attempting the challenge. With a stubborn nod, the boy headed inside. The old house attached to the lighthouse tower was definitely creepy. It was covered in dust and totally abandoned. Everything sat just the way it had when the keeper lived there. There was an eerie feeling of being watched, despite being all alone, but the boy ignored it. That wasn't why he was here, after all. The boy set his sights on the door across the room that led up to the tower. When he reached out and grabbed the handle, he recoiled. For some reason, it was ice cold. It felt like it had been inside a freezer or something. Again, this was odd, but not enough to scare the brave boy away. And so he opened the door. Ahead of him sat the seemingly endless staircase up to the top of the tower. The boy felt like he was climbing forever. About halfway up, something caught the boy's attention. It sounded as though someone was following him up the stairs. He quickly looked behind him, but saw nothing at all. He stood quietly for a minute, but the footsteps did not continue. As he continued to climb, it got colder and colder. He could hear the sound of a vicious wind picking up outside. There must have been a crack somewhere letting it squeeze inside. The wind whistled loudly. The boy paused again when it seemed to almost speak. "Turn back," the wind howled. This did actually make the boy a little nervous, but he shook his head and continued. He was here to prove his bravery, so there was no way a little wind was going to scare him away. So as the wind continued to howl and the distant sound of footsteps echoed behind him, the boy climbed faster and faster. Every so often he would look over his shoulder, but again, there was no one else there. Finally, the boy reached the top of the stairs. No one else at the school had ever made it this far. The boy walked forward and grabbed the handle to the door leading into the room, but it wouldn't budge. The darn thing must have rusted over. He struggled with it a few more times, but still couldn't get it to move. Once more, the wind blew, louder than ever. "Turn back," it seemed to moan. The boy shivered but ignored it. Instead, he decided to try peeking through the little window set into the metal door. It was dusty and grimy, so it was hard to see through, but after pressing his face right up to the glass, the boy could see. Inside was a little room where the keeper used to operate the light. It was anchored in the middle of the room and rotated around and around. This made it very hard to see into the room. Whenever the light spun back toward the boy, it was blinding, but whenever it turned away, the room became extremely dark. The boy squinted and tried his best to catch a glimpse of anything. Eventually, his eyes adjusted and he was able to see into the room for a few seconds before the light turned back to him and he closed his eyes. The room was completely covered in a thick layer of dust right down to the floor. There was what looked like an old chair and a bunch of papers, but no sign of any ghost. What interested the boy most was the door on the other side of the room. That was the one that led outside. That's where the lighthouse keeper had jumped. The boy stared hard at the door until he suddenly noticed something. The handle moved. Goosebumps ran down the boy's back, but he couldn't look away. The light turned toward him, blinding him for a moment. When it turned away, the boy saw the handle was jiggling more violently now. It was impossible for anyone to be out there. Who was yanking on the doorknob? Blinded again. And when his sight returned, the door was slowly beginning to open. The boy was very frightened now, but was even more curious. The wind was howling even louder than before. "Turn back!" But the boy couldn't, blinded again. And then the door was wide open, but still no sign of anyone. The boy's heart beat faster and faster. He couldn't look away, blinded once more. Now there were footprints in the dust. The boy knew he should stay no longer. He should flee, but he was far too curious. The footprints were halfway across the room, blinded again. This time, nothing changed. The dusty room sat quiet, way too quiet. The wind had stopped howling. The whole tower sat in perfect silence. The only thing the boy could hear was his own heartbeat. Blinded again. Wham! A ghostly figure slammed against the door, his eyes staring into the boy's through the small window in the door. Terrified, the boy stumbled backwards. He fell. He fell all the way down the stairs, and as he toppled, the wind picked up one final time. Too late. Story number 3. The Not Deer. One night, far out in the woods of a mountain park, a pair of twins named Max and Molly were riding their ATV. The brother and sister got along very well and rode through these trails often. However, that evening, it had started to get late and the twins were not yet ready to go home. It was firefly season and they wanted to stay out late and watch the little bugs light up the sky. The two decided that it would be worth the scolding from their mother to come back home late, just this once. So, they hopped off the little vehicle and sat down in the nearby field. Sure enough, once the sun had set, the air began to twinkle with hundreds of floating fireflies. Max and Molly were enjoying themselves so much that they completely lost track of time. Before they knew it, it was really quite late. They helped each other up and dusted their pants off before freezing. A moment ago, the area had been full of twinkling lights and the music of singing frogs and crickets. Now, the forest sat in complete darkness and silence. Something felt very wrong. They squinted their eyes and tried to see out into the darkness. Fortunately, they had adjusted to the dark from sitting out in it so long, but they knew as soon as they got onto their ATV, the bright headlights would make them night blind. Anything outside of the narrow beam of light would be all but invisible to them. And so, they chose to linger for a moment. They looked all around and strained their ears to listen, but still no sound came. After a few minutes of this, they decided that it was very important to get home as quickly as possible, and so they ran back to the ATV and started it up immediately. As they drove down the dirt road, they couldn't shake the bad feeling in their guts. Something felt wrong. It was as if something was watching them. Something bad. The entire time they drove, the frog song never started again. It was eerie silence except for the rumble of their engine, and totally dark except for the narrow beam from their headlights. Suddenly, the path ahead was blocked by something. It took a moment for it to register that it was a deer, or at least something that was trying to look like a deer. But it was all wrong. This not deer was large and brown, as a deer should be, but it was too large. It was too tall and leggy. Its legs were long and narrow and stuck into its body at strange angles. Its joints were odd, and there seemed to be too many. Its chest was strangely wide and round, and its head looked more like a horse than a deer. Unlike a normal deer, the not deer did not flee from the sight of the children on the ATV. This was a problem, because the children were far too uneasy about the creature to try driving around it. Max and Molly were frightened and didn't know what else to do, so they tried scaring it off like they would any other deer. They shouted and waved their arms, they flashed their headlights, they even honked their little horn at it. But none of this worked. The not deer stood in place, staring at them with unblinking eyes. Seeing that his sister was very frightened, Max hopped off the ATV and grabbed a rock. Not sure what else to do, he tossed it toward the not deer. This is when it began to move. Rattle. Crack. The not deer began to take steps toward them. It moved in an unnatural and shaky way on its two long legs and its too many joints. Terrified, Max ran back to the ATV and hopped on. The engine roared, and suddenly the not deer reared up onto its hind legs. But it wasn't just rearing up. It began walking. In strange, lurching movements, it walked towards them on two legs. Horrified, they took off. They went as fast as they could and tore around the terrible creature. They drove and they drove as fast as they could until the lights of their back porch were visible again. They turned off the engine and threw themselves at the door, banging and shouting for their mother. When their mother opened the door, she was very upset with the twins. She scolded them harshly for staying out so late and said that in the morning they would discuss punishments. The twins did not care about this. They sobbed and cried about the monster they had just seen in the forest. Seeing how upset her children were, the mother's face softened. She told them that one of the reasons it was so dangerous to stay out late was because so many animals woke up at night. They were lucky it was only a deer and not a cougar or a bear. She told them that the deer they saw probably had a disease that made it act funny. The children shook their heads and insisted it was more than that, but their mother just shushed them. It was already so late, and they needed to get to bed. But the last thing either of them felt like doing was sleeping. The two lay in their beds after their mother said goodnight and closed the door. For a while, things seemed calm, but the bad feeling never went away. They lied in the dark and listened to the crickets, until the crickets stopped. The sinking feeling returned to their guts. Max slowly sat up in his bed and leaned toward the window. He looked out into their backyard and then out toward the woods. And there, just at the edge of the tree line, was the knot deer, still standing on its hind legs. And it was looking right up at them through the window. So now, did you have fun? If you're a fan and want more, please consider checking the link out down below. I'm really excited to be sharing my very first anthology, and I hope to do more in the future. I'll be back again soon to narrate a few more stories as well. But that's all for today. I'll see you next time, and until then, remember, stay creepy.